A year ago, John and I sat down and covered a case that 89,000 of you watched. This is the most watched episode on this entire channel. And since then, I've thought a lot about Sandra Birchmore and Matthew Farwell, and a lot has happened since then, not just because of the numbers of the video, but because the case keeps evolving. The charges even changed. The evidence has changed. And some of what we told you in that last episode, we never set the record straight. The record has since been correct. So we're going to go back. And here's what you kind of need to know about Sandra Birchmore if you've never heard her name before. She was 23 years old. She was 3 months pregnant. She wanted to be a police officer her whole life. That was her whole life's goal. She trusted the people who wore the badge because the people who wore the badge were like her male role models in her life from the time she was just 12 years old. And she was found deceased in her Canton, Massachusetts apartment on February 4th, 2021. And within an hour of finding her body, before a single forensic test had been run, local investigators had communicated to the medical examiner that this was a self-deletion, that there was no foul play. And the medical examiner didn't visit the scene. She just relied on what the first responders told her over the phone. Now, there's a man on surveillance video. He's the last confirmed person inside Sandra Birchmore's apartment to see her live on that night. It's going to shock you who he is if you don't know the story. He was never seriously considered a suspect initially. Then they didn't even compel his DNA, so that became a little suspect. And they didn't seize his devices. They interviewed him in a parking lot about 5 days later. They let him go home. And the FBI spent 3 years building what local investigators closed in an afternoon. And in 2025, an independent auditor reviewed Canton PD's case file, and they made recommendations, especially that death investigation reports need to have a supervisory approval before being finalized. So what they built and what's now sitting in federal court documents ahead of an October trial is what this episode is about. John, you and I covered this case when the FBI affidavit had dropped. We didn't know a whole lot about it. The arrest was just made. And we had the document and we went through it and we gave our audience what we knew at the time. But I want to talk about what we know now. However, when you think back to the original episode, what sticks with you?
Well, we originally covered that episode because we were looking at Karen Reed and we were talking about cover-ups in police departments in Massachusetts, and Canton PD came up in both cases. What's different and memorable about Sandra Birchmore, you mentioned that she trusted the badge from a very young age and that these were her mentors. It was more complex even than that. She was in the Police Explorers program. She spent time with police officers. The suspect in this case was literally one of her mentors. And what we have learned, which is really not a question at all, is that one of these police officers placed in a position not only of public trust, but of personal trust and stewardship over the safety and life of Sandra Birchmore, exploited that position for his own gratification. And one of the saddest stories that I have heard, and we're heading towards a trial here, a federal trial in the next 6 months, that's going to answer a lot of the outstanding questions. The evidence that hasn't been released to the public in this case is going to come out. Either way, it's a black eye for police departments in Massachusetts, for Canton, for Stoughton, but at large. And I think it's important that the police community responds to that. And that's kind of where we come in. I'm an actual 911 dispatcher. I've been doing that job in my community for 11 years. Drew is a former law enforcement officer. He did that in Florida for just about 29 years. And there's this myth about the thin blue line, about how police officers cover up for other police officers. We're here to tell you unequivocally that that's not true. It's been my experience that police officers very quickly, due to rivalries or the negativity which can float around in the department, they're very quick to out each other when bad behavior goes on. But ethically speaking, we're here to do that as well. If the suspect in this case is guilty of substantial wrongdoing, we're here to talk about that. And that's why I think the case is important, Drew.
Thank you for saying all that, because I want to make sure that everyone knows that we call balls and strikes. We're just going to give facts. And if the facts don't align with what your thinking is on this, it may tend to look like, I'm covering for police, or there's some inexcusable stuff here that, I don't render opinions on what the verdict's going to be. And by the way, we are not attorneys. We're just two guys, as John just kind of mentioned to you. But before the FBI and before the arrest, before any of this, there was a phone call that should have changed everything. But for some reason, it didn't. So 15 days before Sandra Birchmore's body was found, somebody who who knew her picked up the phone and they called the Stoughton Police Department, not 911, John. This was the non-emergency line. And what they reported should have immediately triggered a criminal referral. But instead, within hours, the guy that they named in that complaint, he knew the call had been made. So I can tell you from a command standpoint, a complaint like this one is a hot potato when you name an active officer in alleged criminal relationship going back years, especially a capital offense like this would be. It's just not a supervisory matter. It's a totally criminal matter, and those are very different things. So what apparently happened here is that the information found its way back to the officer named in the complaint, and before it found its way to anybody else who can act on it. So what happens when a call like that comes in, John?
Well, every agency has its own operating procedure on how to handle complaints about officers. There's an old saying that police officers tend to rely on, and that's you're not doing your job properly if you're not getting some complaints. Of course, people don't like having the law enforced on them, and they will call in sometimes because they don't like the action the police officer took or the manner in which he took them. But you have to know how to handle those things seriously. It's sometimes if it's a matter of, I don't like how he treated me or whatever, you can handle those things through fairly routine channels if it's just a PR thing. But Matthew Farwell, the suspect in this case, was accused of a very heinous crime with some specificity by someone who was close to the victim, someone who would know, and even a cursory amount of investigation would uncover enough smoke to chase till you get to the fire. A serious crime, a statutory situation, a sexual situation with a child, an accusation of a police officer. Here's the thing. When a police officer gets accused of something like that, they want to be exonerated. They don't like accusations like that floating around. And so they want the truth to have its day. They want that investigation to happen as quickly as possible. They want to have those allegations dismissed as unfounded and get back to their job. But what happened in this case is that someone called, made this accusation, named Farwell, and somehow this information was handled so non-confidentially that the accusation within a very short amount of time wound up in Farwell's hand. And Farwell ended up contacting Sandra Birchmore saying, hey, your friend contacted my work, which completely changes the nature of their dynamic, their situation. And it gives Matthew Farwell all the motive in the world to act in the way in which he's been accused. All of a sudden, his life is threatened, his future, his family life. He's also expecting a child any day now at this time. So he's facing dismissal from the job, being branded a sex offender for the rest of his life. It's all coming down around Matthew Farwell.
Just so you'll know, Stoughton Police Department is, as the crow flies, about 5 to 6 miles from Canton Police Department. And in between is Sandra Birchmore's apartment. He's a Stoughton detective. He's been a Stoughton police officer for many years. He has a twin brother who also worked there at the same time as an officer. She is a resident of Canton. Canton is where the Karen Reed incident took place. So Canton, because of this, it was a death investigation that occurred in their jurisdiction, was the first to respond. The timeline is pretty complex. At 9:13, her phone locks for the final time. It's never unlocked again by Sandra Birchmore, sadly and chillingly. 14 minutes after 9 is when Farwell enters the building. So the surveillance captures it. You're going to see a different time on the surveillance footage, and we'll cover all of that in a second. At 9:40, though, the final step data was recorded. So she, however her phone was whether it was in her hand or near her, 9:40 was like probably her final steps, according to the Apple Health data, which is interesting in and of itself that we're using Apple Health data in this. And at 9:43, he exited the building because that's what the surveillance tells us. So in the morning of February 4th, this is 3 days later, the colleagues of Sandra Birchmore report her missing. It's just not like her. She worked at a public school.
I believe it was an SRO at her school, actually. It was, ironically, it was a police officer who reported her missing and asked Canton to do a welfare check on her.
Yeah. So she goes downstairs and brushes off her car. She comes back in. These are like, little does she know, this is at 5:46. This is like her final moments on Earth. I mean, whether she knows or not, we don't know that the FBI agent did. It was like an initial investigation. This is the same thing that we we covered in the first thing. And you'll see that the agent had reviewed Birchmore's phone, and the phone was locked from 9:13 on February 1st, 2021 until the device powered off because of battery loss. So just slowly the battery just trickled down until there was no life left. And there was a black screen at 9:18.
This is our suspect entering the building from outside. What's very interesting about this is that this has been positively identified as Matthew Farwell, who's wearing a COVID-19 mask. Matthew Farwell was one of the more outspoken voices during that time, saying that he didn't want to be wearing a mask while he was on duty as a police officer, but conveniently, even though he's not encountering anyone outside or in the lobby, and he's on his way to Sandra Birchmore, someone who he's had frequent close contact with, he's concerned about COVID at this time.
So he gets in the elevator, kind of wipes his feet courteously. I don't know if he's, for whatever reason, it was snowing out. But this is where we're at in the investigation, according to the document. The surveillance video showed Farwell entering Birchmore's Canton apartment at about 9:14 p.m. And in the surveillance video, Farwell is wearing street clothes, including a hoodie with the hood up and a face mask that's similar to the medical face mask that many people use during the COVID-19 pandemic. And as John just explained to you, this is written right into this agent's affidavit that, she had interviewed multiple witnesses. They all indicated that he resisted wearing a mask during the pandemic. And one of the witnesses said that he would only wear a mask when he was on duty and required by policy to do so. Other than that, he wanted nothing to do with the mask. But as John just pointed out, he did that night for whatever reason. It also says as a footnote in here, she's aware that the electronic timestamp on the apartment complex's video surveillance system was off by 13 minutes. The surveillance video times set forth in that affidavit that we're reading from account for that 13-minute difference and therefore the approximate real time of the events. So they've already accounted for this. This happens a lot in investigations, John. It's called time drift. You're never going to find a surveillance video that is like perfectly in sync unless it's run off of a satellite or something to that effect. There are times when it's an entire hour off because somebody didn't change the time from Eastern Standard to Daylight Savings. There are times when there are 3 or 4 videos on a system and they all have 3 or 4 different times, like they don't sync up. They are a nightmare. But you can take certain landmark points, like Sandra going down to meet the guy with her sandwich or something like that. And you could sync up the movement of her phone or her watch with the time and figure out from there. So in sum, we've got a complaint in the system. It's a named officer, a named victim, and an alleged criminal relationship going back years. 15 days later, officers from Canton PD respond to that same woman's apartment. They find her dead. And the unknown male profile of this surveillance video at the time is just a physical description. Detective McCourt's supplemental report says that he's a tall, burly person with a black mask. It's presumably the hood, part with 9-line apparel, and it's that kind of stands out because 9-line is more military or law enforcement related. I mean, it's available to anybody, but it's generally
it's a brand that people like that prefer. I mean, I think I have a 9-line t-shirt.
Okay, so this is the time when he's leaving. You can see he's kind of, it's almost like I don't want to read into it. I don't want my imagination to run wild with this, but it's like he hurriedly leaves. The converse of that is then he just walks out so matter-of-factly. You know what I mean? So either he's rushing to get out of there or he just doesn't care. And you know what I mean?
Well, whatever happened was a tense interaction. I mean, they've got a bad situation going on between them, so it's easy to read that as him hurriedly leaving the scene, and things have not ended well between them. And since we know that Sandra Birchmore didn't interact with her phone or walk around after this, either he left the apartment with her in a state of mind in which she wanted to harm herself, or he's just done that work for her.
So here's the question I keep coming back to, John. Did those officers who responded to the scene have any awareness of that complaint? It was made like 2 weeks earlier or however long it was, because what happened in that apartment what happened in the apartment in the first hour, the decisions that were made and the calls that went out, that's where the case either gets investigated or it doesn't, and it didn't. Like according to this affidavit that the FBI agent wrote, the health data on Birchmore's phone indicates that the last movement recorded by the phone on February 1st occurred at 9:40, which was 3 minutes before Farwell was captured on surveillance video leaving Birchmore's apartment. And you just saw that. That's when he walked out. So this data indicates specifically that the mechanism that Apple uses to record movement registered 8 steps at approximately 9:40. And these recorded steps occurred while Farwell was still in Birchmore's apartment, and the phone recorded no additional steps between 9:40 and the time it was recovered by first responders on February 4th.
Yeah. So we talked about Canton PD being the first on the scene through their welfare check. This was 3 days later. They get to the scene and they find Sandra Birchmore sadly deceased, her and her unborn son sadly deceased. But within an hour of that initial crime scene investigation, they determined that there's no foul play, that it's clearly an instance of self-harm taken to its extreme. They log that she has a scarf around her neck, which was later identified not as a scarf, something that you would expect to find around someone's neck in the snow, but a duffel bag strap. But I want to push back because a lot of people who are looking at this, criticizing the Canton response to the crime scene, which you're going to unpack here. Drew, police officers sadly come to the scene of people who have done themselves in very often. It's something where it's almost a confirmation bias. You see something that whether it actually is one or it's a stage one, it's easy to believe because it's so common. People are mad that the police did not dust for prints and seize cell phones and search records and look at known associates and look at the surveillance footage from the apartment complex before and after. Did you want to talk about a little bit what it's like to be a police officer and what expectations you have when you arrive at an unattended death? Do you go into it with a pretty open mind? Do you think it's going to be the case of the century when you find something like this?
You need to treat it like the case of the century. And like any police department, any field training officer who's training a recruit, all the way up to any chief of police who's talking to his executive staff, are going to tell you the same thing. Treat this thing like it's a homicide until you can prove otherwise.
One thing that the defense right now is relying on pretty heavily, they found on her computer when they're doing the digital footprint, is that this was one of Sandra's Google searches. I think she did this a day or so before Farwell's fateful visit. Is that she wanted to know what color the ribbon was to remember victims of self-harm. She literally Googled that.
Here's something that I think we need to address. In the original episode, we reported that Farwell Googled whether he could, I think, revoke consent in Massachusetts. And we stated that as fact. But the defense has since filed in federal court and explicitly denied that search ever occurred. I think that maybe it was a different wording. So we're not going to repeat it as it was established fact, because it's not necessarily established fact. It's actually disputed. And that's a distinction that matters to us. We want to make sure that we get it right. Like, yeah, I get the guy's a murder defendant, but everybody is innocent until proven guilty. So there's one more thing about the scene response that I think that we need to address. In 2025, an independent auditor had conducted a full on-site audit of the Canton Police Department. They reviewed Canton PD's case file on the Sandra Birchmore death. This was on the heels of Karen Reed and the John O'Keefe investigation. The town of Canton summoned this Five Stones Intelligence consultancy group to come in and do an independent audit of the Canton Police Department on behalf of the town of Canton. And they reviewed the case file on the Sandra Birchmore death. And in their recommendations, they stated that the audit team reviewed a Canton PD detective's report. They said that Sandra Birchmore died of self-deletion, and that they recommended that all death investigation reports be reviewed and approved by the chief of investigations before even being finalized, which I think should go without saying in any department, to be honest with you. But that was one of their main recommendations in that entire report. The recommendation exists because the original report was inadequate. Like, they called a spade on that. And
didn't they also find out that the complaint issued by Sandra Birchmore's friend was also mishandled internally by the department? I mean, it had to have, if that complaint went directly to Matthew Farwell.
The FBI obtained DNA sample from Matthew Farwell, but it was after his arrest in August of 2024. It's kind of procedural. And his DNA was found in the duffel bag strap. That's the whole ligature that was tied around Sandra's neck. And his DNA was also found in her underwear at the time of her death. Here's the thing, though. He had been in her apartment. He never denied that. There are things that could explain that away. That's up to his defense attorneys. But he gave this interview in a parking lot.
There's also people who are involved who have testified to things who have said that Matthew Farwell was making some pretty strange statements, like the problem that he had, his extramarital affair with Sandra Birchmore was a problem that was going to take care of itself. Apparently, he said that just 2 weeks before Sandra Birchmore was found deceased, which would have been right in the timeline of when that complaint came in to the police department. So what does it mean that a problem is going to take care of itself? Trying to unpack that with just an unbiased approach, I don't know what that could possibly mean. The problem of you having a baby with your wife due any moment, and then finding out that a girl that you've had an underage relationship with is also pregnant at the same time. That situation's not going away. That situation's not going to take care of itself. That situation's going to explode. Case in point, another witness said that he received a text that, well, Matthew Farwell was in the hospital with his wife while she was in labor, which you would think would completely captivate the attention of someone who's about to be a father again, and to be tending to his wife and worried about all the medical processes that go on with that, that he's texting his coworker, is anything going on at work? Drew, as a general rule, when we're off duty, we don't ask about what's going on at work on any given day. And so it's very strange that he would be asking a coworker, hey, anything going on at work? And this is all within the context of him checking to see whether or not Sandra Birchmore's body has been found. If she is deceased at this point, he has no idea what the time frame will be for the discovery of her body. Will a friend or a relative drop by and check on Sandra? Will a neighbor have heard something? Did someone see him leaving from the scene? He couldn't have known that it would take up to 3 days before a welfare check would be done and she would be found by Canton. There's also a second witness that told Canton PD detectives that Birchmore had been dating a police officer and that he didn't want the baby, and that if she didn't get it taken care of, that he would take care of that problem himself.
One witness that had indicated that he was at work. He was feverishly taking phone calls and private phone calls, and the witness asked Farwell what was wrong, and Farwell indicated that he had to put crazy back in the bag and that everything was going to be okay. And this witness had indicated that Farwell had become increasingly stressed in January of 2021. The timing just, that check-in kind of made sense when you're investigating this thing. And it's right in the audit, John. Canton PD detectives conducted a follow-up. They conducted follow-up at Windsor Woods. And a second witness told those Canton PD detectives that Birchmore had been dating a police officer who did not want the baby. And that if she didn't get an abortion, he was going to take care of the problem itself. And that witness statement is actually documented in the report properly, like it's supposed to be. So here's where things get a little iffy between, very, very tense between the defense and the prosecution in this, which is, by the way, the federal government. The opinion of the medical examiner in the state of Massachusetts for that region says that this is a suicide. It is a medical opinion that this is the cause of death, or the manner of death is suicide. The federal government is alleging in other affidavits that it is homicide. But what they have skipped is they had gone to somebody from the Department of Defense who does these investigations, a certified forensic pathologist, who agreed with the Commonwealth that this was a suicide. And until they found somebody else, a guy named Dr. Smock, he's a doctor of emergency medicine, he gave this other opinion. So Dr. William Smock said that he supports the government's theory in this case. So they ignored suicide in the Commonwealth. They ignored suicide in their own investigation. They found Dr. Smock. And then the family hired who, John? The very famous Dr. Michael Baden. So the board certified pathologist from the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System within the Department of Defense agreed with the OCME opinion of both cause and manner of death that Ms. Birchmore committed suicide by hanging, and concluded there was nothing supporting a finding of manual strangulation. The defense is not aware of whether the second opinion confirming the OCME's findings have been shared with OCME. So they don't, the government is saying that they had a meeting with this Dr. Smock and the OCME representative from the Commonwealth, and they hashed it out, and they agreed to disagree. But the defense is saying, whoa, you left something very important out of this conversation. So does that give you kind of any pause, John?
It shows me that what the jury is going to have to be looking at in this federal trial that's coming up is a battle of experts, which happens a lot in trials like these. It's going to come down to who has more credulity. We saw that in the Karen Reed case, that you can get an expert from anywhere. You can find anyone who will testify to anything. Of course, the state's medical examiner's office has a certain amount of credulity built into it because they're the default. They're the one who decides these things all the time. They're not someone who was shopped for and made the determination that it was not a homicide right from go, and they haven't changed their mind on that. I think that's going to carry a lot of weight. And whoever the prosecution is that's going to bring this in to try to undo their colleagues in the state's medical examiner office really has the work cut out for them.
It should be noted that it's been widely reported in the media. It's been reported on social media, obviously, but specifically Ted Daniel from Fox 25 News. They keep reporting about these two differing findings. The problem is the OCME has never changed. They've never wavered. They still maintain that this is a suicide. And that second person, the first one that the government went to, agree. They think the same thing. So despite, it's written right in this defense kind of argument, despite efforts by the government and its retained expert to meet with OCME regarding its opinion of Miss Birchmore's cause of death, OCME has not changed its conclusion that Miss Birchmore died by her own hand.
I have a question for you about that interview, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
A lot of people are saying, well, this is deference to the badge. This is the thin blue line, the thin blue wall, not treating another police officer as a serious suspect. If you are looking at Matthew Farwell as a suspect, wouldn't it be to your advantage to not tip him off to that as much as possible? For example, if you bring him down to the interrogation room, if you bring him, sit him down and he's under the camera and the microphone and he knows about how that entire process works, isn't he more likely to clam up? If you confront him sort of casually in a place that's open and ask him some open-ended questions just to kind of see where he's at on these things, or if he's giving you any indicators right away of deception, or if his story doesn't jibe with established facts or other people's testimony or other people's stories, isn't that actually kind of a good way to approach the subject? Is it deference to the badge, Drew, or is it them being tactically minded about whether or not Matthew Farwell could be a suspect?
Yeah, I don't think it's any special because even on the end of the scale that would call this like incompetence or whatever, you can still recover from this as they did as the investigation progressed, watching Matthew Farwell, watching what his actions are. And they didn't have access to his phone. They didn't have access to his data. They recovered some of her things in there, and they recovered like her iCloud stuff, but that came later. Like a lot of these aha moments that a lot of people point out in this investigation are all hindsight. Like the investigation just evolved. And that's why I think the phone call was so important, the phone call that came into Stoughton PD, because if they knew then about that phone call, I think that would have changed the scope of the investigation. It probably would have changed the scope of the interview. But yes, you're right in a sense. Like it wouldn't be the first time that we just knock on somebody's door, ask them a few questions to get them thinking like, okay, maybe they're on to us, or maybe they're on to me, and watch the reaction and see how it plays out from there.
I guess I want to know from our viewers, do you feel like being confronted about something so serious as potential sexual assault allegations and a potential murder, do you think being interviewed about it in a school parking lot is sign of deference to a police officer, or do you think that it's police officers being smart and tactical about it? Do you think that further evidence that the same police apparatus that mishandled the complaint from Sandra Birchmore's friend continues to not take Matthew Farwell's involvement seriously? If you do have a comment on that, leave that in the comments section below. We actually respond to 99.9% comments. So whatever it is that your thoughts are, we would love to hear those and respond to those, Drew. But something that is very damning that came out since then is testimony that while Matthew Farwell was intoxicated at a party, for some reason, the subject of Sandra Birchmore comes up and he does this reenactment of what the crime scene looked like, about how she was found hanging from a doorknob and what the position was. And even though there's conflicts in those reports about exactly how that was, how she was found, and how there's an impression from a buckle which isn't consistent from hanging. There's a broken necklace and strands of her hair that are signs of a struggle. But he reenacts deliberately the scene in which Sandra was found. Now, he wasn't part of that crime scene investigation. You have to remember, he works for Stoughton, not for Canton. So he wasn't someone that responded to the scene. He was, waiting for that situation to be resolved, waiting for her body to be found. He was in the hospital. these crime scene photos, the crime scene investigation, these are details that are not going to be made public. But he's showing intimate knowledge of the crime scene. Not only does that suggest that he was there, but that he orchestrated all of it, that he knew exactly how to set that up so that when police officers and first responders got to the scene, that they would break the circuit of investigation by saying, well, this is a straightforward act of egregious self-harm, and that the medical examiner would never be called to the scene, and there would never be any deeper investigation, because when police officers find a scene where someone has ended their life, that ends all deep investigation. He knows that that's the way to bring the investigation to the end. But I guess one thing, if I'm the defense, that I would say to that is that, we have leaks of information going around. People are talking to Matthew Farwell about complaints being made against him. As a police officer, Drew, is it uncommon for someone to go through back channels to find out details like that? If a police officer was asked for photos by someone from another agency, is that going to be viewed as suspicious? Is that going to be documented? How is that going to be teased out once people are talking to witnesses about this bizarre and inappropriate and tasteless reenactment of Sandra Birchmore's crime scene?
It's chilling, because you don't want to believe that information got out, whether it got out inadvertently or purposely, and it got into Matthew Farwell's hands. But I can tell you, like, just from the year, that's the whole reason why we don't talk about it. That's the whole reason why we don't share the information with the media, or we don't talk about the entire crime scene. It just, if somebody volunteers information that is non-public about a death scene in a social setting, it tends to say they were there. It means that they know what the scene looked like. It means that they created it. And it means that at some level, like under the influence, something in them needed to show someone that they had done it. Like, that came out when he was drinking. Luckily, the post commission has taken actually four certifications in this case. Matthew, his brother William, there's a Robert Devine, who was their original explorer. He brought them into the Explorer program. Then there was another guy from another agency who was also doing inappropriate things with her. It's important to remember, because a lot of people forget this. Matthew is the only one that was considered a suspect in the grooming part, having sex with her when she was underage. Once she turned, age of consent, or 18, or, whatever it is in the Commonwealth, those guys aren't necessarily subjected to criminal charges for that part of it. They're definitely up for criminal charges for, like, having sex on duty, let's say, or, conduct unbecoming. So the three employees who were implicated, this is right straight from the Internal Affairs report, the three employees who were implicated as subjects in the investigation resigned from employment. They're now required to make notification of the post commission. And it was the recommendation that Robert Devine, William Farwell, and Matthew Farwell have their certifications revoked by post, and that they be entered into the National Decertification Index. They also went as far as to say, John, that they wanted this, all of these transcripts of their interviews and all that to be given to a forensic psychologist.
I think it's important that we prevent things like this from happening, not just because the community deserves good behavior from police officers, but obviously with police explorer programs, we're sending our youth there, and what we don't want them to see is them being groomed. We want to see responsible police officers raising our kids to have faith in the program and to be pro-police and to be good citizens, if not pro-police. But what we're seeing is incredible and terrible exploitation. Even if Matthew Farwell is innocent of ending the life of Sandra Birchmore, what we've seen out of this is truly disgusting.
Yeah, they're the protectors, and you especially kids. Like, you're expected to protect the children. Everything that we just laid out, the DNA, the timeline, the 3 witnesses, the false statements, the reenactment, it's the prosecution's case that's heading into October. You see here that both Farwells, Matthew, the former Stoughton PD detective, and William, his twin, the former Stoughton PD officer, and their supervisor anyway, former Stoughton PD deputy chief Robert Devine, they were all decertified by the Post Commission in Massachusetts way back in December. Matthew is scheduled for trial in October. Joshua Heel is just another one. He's a former school resource officer. He was a part-time officer, but he did work for Stoughton for a little bit. He worked in animal control, and that's where he first met Sandra. So it seemed to me that she was definitely looking for companionship, or she was looking to these guys to, I don't know if they were just big brothers or what, but
they were the men in her life. She was surrounded by police officers, and a code of conduct for men in general needs to be to a higher standard, but specifically for police officers and for police officers who are SROs and in that Explorer program.
Yeah, they met because she would show up at animal control and play with the cat. She ended up adopting a cat, but and he kind of, like, according to his IA report, he kind of befriended her because Ben wanted to take in the sick and the wounded, so to speak. And, she was a prime candidate, but unfortunately it just turned the way it did. So here's count 1, which is killing a witness or a victim, and the grand jury charged that they reallege that on or before February 1st in 2021 in Canton, the defendant Matthew Farwell did kill Sandra Birchmore, a person known to the grand jury, with malice aforethought, willfully, deliberately, maliciously, and with premeditation. The death penalty apparently is off the table because the Department of Justice has said so. The second charge in this thing is the protection of unborn children. They're charging him the death of her unborn child.
And that's the bomb that dropped in this case that just recently came out, is that Matthew Farwell is actually not the father of Sandra Birchmore's unborn son. It doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that he wasn't operating under the belief that he was the entire time. It's not like that completely undoes his motive, because if he believed he was the father, everything that follows from that still makes sense according to that, if that is a motive. It just adds an extra dimension of tragedy, because if Matthew Farwell had just left her alone, she would have had her son. He would still be alive, as would Sandra Birchmore, but he wouldn't be paying extra child support to a child that wasn't his. Yes, he would be in trouble. Yes, he would have lost his job, but there was no reason for him to end the life of Sandra Birchmore or her unborn son, because he wasn't the father.
The defense is definitely not without an argument if you're going to understand what a jury is actually going to wrestle with in this federal courtroom, and not because we're advocating for it, but these are facts. When you don't get to decide what's true only by presenting one side, that's something you have to take. Here's what Farwell's attorneys have put before a federal judge. The Massachusetts Office of the Chief Medical Examiner has not changed its ruling. As of right now, the official cause of death is still suicide by asphyxia. The defense has a board-certified pathologist affiliated with the Armed Forces Medical Examiner System at the Department of Defense, who actually reviewed this case and agreed with that finding. And on the morning of her death, on February 1st, Sandra Birchmore Googled what it looked like, what color the ribbon for somebody who takes their life. And the defense put that in a court filing. The prosecution didn't disclose that in their original detention motion, so the defense is going to use that omission kind of against them. And the defense also argues that Birchmore had a documented history of suicidal ideation. Okay, so that history, when you combine it with the Google search and the ME's thing, this is a credible path to reasonable doubt. It's something that people need to be prepared for. And here's what the Canton audit actually said about the scene response, because it does cut both ways. And the audit concluded that Canton PD officers followed all procedures related to crime scene preservation. The institutional failure the audit identified was more in death investigation reports and the recommendation process, and how the scene should have been secured. And that's just a distinction the defense is going to use. They're going to ride on the coattails of the Karen Reed case. So the Canton PD followed their protocols at the scene. An external auditor said so. It's in writing, and it's a genuine argument, John.
Looking forward to finding out how this case is going to turn out. Of course, it's going to be in federal court, which means there's not going to be any cameras in there. We're not going to see footage of the trial, but news and information is going to come out about that in the community. Both the public and police are going to be looking for how this is going to turn out. Even the allegations are a black eye for police officers everywhere. We're constantly having to try to convince the public that when we wake up every every day and go out there with it. We're trying to affect positive change in our communities and programs like the Explorer program, but just on our beat when we're driving around, patrolling around the neighborhood and investigating crimes, that we're doing the right thing, that we're on the side of the angels, that we're making a difference. And then one case comes out like this, not to diminish the significance of this case, but it casts a shadow over all of police, and it makes people suspicious of our motives. Words like grooming get thrown around, and all of a sudden, police officers are having to beat the reputation that we're abusing authority in all kinds of ways. And it's really a sad thing. And unfortunately, I don't know how the trial is going to go. You never know what kind of evidence is being held back. You never know how a jury is going to decide. The appearance of impropriety is bad enough. And hopefully we can move on from this and help police officers, especially since there are so many good ones. Millions of calls for service every day going appropriately and justice being done. Hopefully we can get back to talking about that, Drew.
No matter how she died, she didn't deserve it. Sandra Birchmore should be here with her son, as you said a minute ago. And I think it's going to be crucial to watch that DOD pathologist, because he's a government affiliated expert. He reviewed the case. He agreed it was a suicide. And if that testimony holds under cross-examination, the jury just has something else to anchor their reasonable doubt to. It makes the forensic case significantly cleaner. But rest assured, we're going to get back on this case when it goes to trial. And not to tell you what the verdict should be, that's not our job, and it never will be, but because this case deserves to be covered by people who understand the evidence and actually what it means from the inside of the system that produced it. Sandra Birchmore wanted to be a police officer. She trusted people who wore the badge with her safety, with her future, and with her life. And she deserved better than what she got from the system. There's no question about it. She was trying to become a part of that system. And that's what we're here for. We'll hold them accountable just the same.
If you got to this point in the video, it means you loved what you saw. Make sure you're hitting subscribe. If you liked seeing true crime and hearing about how it works from the inside from a police officer, Drew did that job 29 years, and from a dispatcher that's doing it still, hit like, hit subscribe. Even consider becoming a member. You'll get lots more content like this, and make sure that people who like this content will have a better chance to see it. So we'd appreciate it if you did hit like and subscribe. You can find plenty more episodes here. Our previous Sandra Birchmore case, other cases that are related to this. We got 10,000 episodes. We're going to do 10,000 more, Drew.
Maybe 20,000.
10 to 20,000 more.